We are ready.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. I'm Deborah Caldwell-Stone. I'm director of ALA's Office for Intellectual Freedom, and I'd like to welcome you today to today's coffee Q&A with the authors of Something Happened in Our Town, one of the top 10 most challenged books for 2020. Now, this week, we're observing National Library Week, our annual celebration of America's libraries and libraries workers. And each year, as part of National Library Week, we release the top 10 most challenged books of the previous year. The list represents a snapshot of the censorship attempts we're observing in libraries and schools across the country. Now, we compile the top 10 list from challenges that are reported in the media, as well as censorship reports that are submitted through the OIF's challenge reporting form. OIF encourages everyone to report any and all instances of censorship and challenges to books, online resources, programs, displays, reading lists, and speakers. You can be an important part of the campaign to protect the freedom to read by reporting any censorship that comes to your attention. No incident is too small to report. Now, you can report online by going to ala.org challenge reporting. Ellie has posted the link in the chat, and you can see it here on the slide. Now, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's chat. Sam Helmick is the Community and Access Service Coordinator at the Iowa City Public Library. They have served as ALA counselor for the Iowa chapter on the Iowa Governor's Commission of Libraries and on the reviewing committees for the Stonewall Book Award, Sophie Brody Award, and the Michael L. Prince Award. Sam is the chair-elect for the ALA Intellectual Freedom Roundtable and was recently elected to serve on the ALA Executive Board. Sam, would you like to take over?
Thank you so much, Deborah. It is a delight to be here with the Office of Intellectual Freedom and our wonderful panelists and a great cup of coffee to be able to talk about Something Happened in Our Town, a child story about racial injustice by our wonderful panelists, Marianne Celano, Marietta Collins, and Ann Hazzard. This is an excellent book that I've just borrowed from my library that really recounts a timely story. It's about two families, one Black and one white, having conversations with their children about an incident that has happened in their town, the fatal shooting of a Black man by police. This has been the 6th most challenged book this year for a couple of probably obvious reasons to those who follow challenges to books and curriculum throughout the nation. First, folks have been concerned about how it depicts law enforcement, but I think probably more close to what we're all used to reviewing when we look at censorship across the nation, that caregivers and parents, anytime there's like an enhanced conversation that really deeply affects social structures and how we navigate the world, we have an enhanced response by not only teachers, but parents. What's really fascinating about this book is that not only has it been called to be banned, but it's also created a conversation that is influencing policy for educators and what they can introduce in their classrooms. So I would be very honored to introduce all 3 of our authors. Marianne Celano, PhD, APBB, is a family psychologist and professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Emory University School of Medicine in Atlanta. She specializes in psychotherapy with children and families, sometimes using stories to help children and parents heal and understand one another. She divides her time between writing, reading, clinical work, training, behavioral health providers, and community advocacy focused on social justice. Marietta Collins, PhD, is a clinical psychologist who worked with high-risk children, adolescents, and families as a faculty member of the Emory University School of Medicine for over 2 decades. Since 2016, she has been the associate professor and the director of behavioral medicine in the Department of Family Medicine at Morehouse School of Medicine. In this role, she trains medical and behavioral health providers while providing clinical services to underserved adults, youth, and families. She is actively involved in the faith community and enjoys mentoring African American children, adolescents, and early career professionals. Ann Hazzard, PhD, APPP, is a clinical psychologist who has worked with children and families throughout her career. She recently retired from Emory University School of Medicine. At Emory, she supervised pediatrics and psychological residents and conducted research on child trauma and other issues, publishing 30 articles in professional journals. She has been a board member of several community nonprofits, including organizations focused on child abuse prevention, bereavement support for children, promotion of children's literacy, and reduction of healthcare disparities. She developed therapeutic stories for many child clients when she was a practicing psychologist and is enjoying the freedom to expand her creative efforts during retirement. I encourage our panelists to ask questions either in the Q&A box for Zoom, but also in the comment section of our Banned Book Week Facebook page. And if I may, I'm going to kick off with the first question. What was your first reaction when you found out that your children's book was #6 most challenged book in the United States?
Thank you for inviting us. First of all, thank you for allowing us to talk about the book. I think we should all answer this question. My reaction was, first of all, I was delighted to be on any list with Toni Morrison, Jason Reynolds, and Lori Halse Anderson. But second, I was bewildered about the notion of banning our book, because censoring our book is like censoring the person who calls the fire department when they see a burning house. We didn't cause the fire, we're just trying to draw attention to it so that we can all put it out.
That's a great answer, Marianne. I really like that. I must admit that I was not at all familiar with the challenged book list, but once I researched it, I was very pleased to be in the company of such great authors. It really reminded me of something my daughter said. This is when our book was first published. What was it, in 2018, I believe. And at that time, the Washington Post did an article about the book. It was a very negative article. And my daughter said, well, Mom, if you ain't popping, they ain't talking. You know? Yeah, so that kind of helped me to understand that, you know, being on this list meant that we must be popping since they were talking.
For me, it led me to reflect on sort of the roller coaster of emotions we've experienced around the book over the past year, especially. Obviously, it was a low point for all of us, the killings of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and others. So that was a low point. But then after that, we were feeling encouraged because there were so many parents and educators finding our book for the first time, even though it had been published in 2018, and there was a lot of buzz and thanks from parents and teachers about this resource. And then came the backlash. So, you know, it was disappointing, and I felt badly for teachers that were trying to have courageous conversations and the attempts to shut that down. So for me, it's been a roller coaster.
Thank you all so much. I think that's a nice segue into our first question from a participant. What is the response to your book from children? Since we are hearing a lot about adult responses, I hope they engage with it. Thank you, Teresa.
Great question. Well, we've all had experience reading the book to children of various ages in various different settings. And by and large, the response of the children has been positive. They seem to easily understand that it's important to treat everyone fairly. They ask good questions. They can relate to the experience of both characters in the book. We've read it to groups of kids as young as 4 or 5 and as old as what, 10, 11? Yeah. In homes, but also in classroom kind of environments. And we have not gotten any negative reactions from kids. You guys, I have not.
As a matter of fact, I've also read the book in a church setting, and my church is Sunday school class, and the kids again were, you know, ranged in age from being very young to also being, I would say, maybe 10 or 12 years old at most. And they were very intrigued by the book. They loved the illustrations of the book. And they were able to follow the story and ask questions. So, you know, it's generally been a very positive response to the book.
You know, one of the critiques that has been made is concern that that kids would develop negative attitudes about the police because of the book, because, you know, the families, especially the teenagers in the families, express concerns about police bias. But we have not found that to be true. I think kids maintain, most kids in our culture have had police presented to them as helpers, and there's a lot of that information in popular media. And so I think kids maintain that view of policemen, police officers as primarily helpers, but they do learn from the book that police can make mistakes, that those mistakes can be serious and deadly. So they learn a more nuanced way of looking at police that I think, you know, is healthy.
Can I jump on that question? There were two things I noticed in the book about positive messages and acceptance. The first one was when Josh is playing chess with Dad, and I love the symbolism of chess and the knight. And Josh says, "I have power and I am smart." And then his mother added, "And you can change people's hearts." She's playing the queen. So I was curious if your little folks reacted to that one, as well as when Emma says, "We don't want to miss out, because if we exclude someone, we all miss out." And so I was curious about your audience reaction to both of those affirmations.
On the second one, I'll say that I think when we ask sort of open-ended questions about what was the message of the book, kids generally focus, there's sort of two main responses. One is on the message of inclusion. So they focus very heavily on the last part of the book, which is about what they can do in their personal lives to fight against racism and be inclusive. So they talk a lot about being kind and including everyone. And then the other message that they do get the message that racism is unfair treatment of others based on their skin color. And so they get that message that you shouldn't do that.
Right.
Now, what about the message of empowerment, especially for African American kids? Have you guys, I'm trying to think back about kids' responses to that message.
What I would say is that, you know, the kids, and I've read the book to kids who are African American, as well as, you know, just kids who are of color and kids who are white. And they really have appreciated the pieces that have to do with I'm talking about slavery openly, okay? And also one of the pictures has different Black activists. And they really enjoy identifying the activists and letting us know, you know, what they know about this person, what they know about Harriet Tubman, what they know about Nelson Mandela. They also they like the family, the warmth of the family, you know, the Black family, the dad, you know, standing up for his son. And, you know, they really like, what's really interesting is they like the way that the mother's hair looks, because her hair, we were really, you know, we talked a lot about the illustrations, and, you know, we wanted, you know, this portrayal of an African American family to be realistic and to also be positive, but they really liked the way the mother's hair looked, because her hair looked like their hair or their mother's hair, so they could really identify with that.
Props to Jennifer Zavoyne, our illustrator. And before we go on, Sam, I wanted to, I really am glad you pointed out the line, you don't want to miss out, because we very deliberately wanted to get across the message, not you should include people, you should invite everyone to your birthday party because it's the right thing to do, but also you should invite everyone to your birthday party because you are going to miss out if you don't, right? It's not just that we tolerate diversity. Diversity adds value, right? And so that we wanted to get that message across in the book, and birthday party kind of analogy seemed to do it for us.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate that. We have another question from a participant. Are you all planning to write more books for children on this topic?
I mean, you should ask.
Okay, we probably didn't pay that person to ask this question, but we have a new book that's not directly about racism, but also can be used to talk about racism, which happens to be coming out next week, and it's called Something Happened in Our Park. It's about a little boy named Miles, whose older cousin gets injured yeah, somebody else can hold it up. His older cousin gets injured in a shooting in the neighborhood park, and so his reaction is initially to be afraid and want to avoid the park. But he learns to overcome his fear, and the community, his family and his community join together to make the neighborhood safer for everyone. So it is, you know, it's about community gun violence, but that is a problem that affects some low-income communities and communities of color. So it is in the background of the story are opportunities to talk about systemic racism and economic disenfranchisement and how that affects communities, but also importantly, what communities can do to empower themselves and make things better.
Could you remind me again when that excellent book comes out?
Yeah, April 27th is the date we're getting it.
Fantastic. That's wonderful.
I will note that one component of the community's response is to partner with police in a community, in an example of a community policing approach, which is that the police officers start coaching the neighborhood track team. So
there's more integration with the community.
Yeah, so it's presenting sort of a positive aspect of what police can do to be part of the solution in a positive way.
That's brilliant. And it leads right into our next question. Something happened in our town was challenged for divisive language, and it was thought to promote anti-police views. Two other titles that were actually on the top 10 most challenged books this year include All American Boys and The Hate You Give. And so we're curious about what you think about this trend of challenging titles that address police violence and racial injustice. It looks like you're encountering that with book 2.
Right. So first of all, so honored to be on any list with Angie Thomas and Jason Reynolds. In fact, I gave a copy of this book to Angie Thomas when she came to Atlanta at the Decatur Book Festival. And I think I gave a copy to Jason Reynolds as well. So honored to be included with them. In terms of the general question about anti-police, this has come up a lot over the past year. And, you know, our intent in writing this book was never to vilify the police or undermine children's confidence in the police, but instead to use the fact of disproportionate police killings and brutality towards African Americans as an example of racial bias, and to give children and parents a way of talking about that and helping children to counter racial injustice and racial bias in their lives. The language we use in the book is, instead of saying racial bias, we say a pattern of white people being nice to other white people and mean to Black people. And we talk about its historical origins and so forth. The reason we decided to be direct about racial injustice by police is because that's Black people's experience. And we know that one of the teen characters in the book talks about this, and you know, perhaps the most modulated perspective is offered by the Black father, who says, and this is a quote from the book, "There are many cops, Black and white, who make good choices, but we can't always depend on them to do what's right." I mean, that is people's experience, right? However, in the back of the book, in the section in the note to caregivers, thank you for putting that up, we have more examples of how to talk about police officers, and there are several suggestions for how parents can respond to questions from kids. We offer dialogue like, shooting police is never right? Most police officers never fire their guns. They try to solve problems other ways. there are many police officers who work hard to help people. So, you know, we try to offer a balanced account because it's important to recognize that we depend on police officers to keep communities safe, right? But the experience of Black people cannot be ignored. And it is an example of racial injustice and bias.
And I also just wanted to add that we felt that it would be disingenuous not to include that in the conversation that the Black family was having with their son. You know, when their son came up with the question, why do police hate us? You know, it would have been disingenuous for us not to talk about or reflect the experiences of many, you know, Black folk in America in regards to the police. You know, but we also wanted to acknowledge the fact that even though, you know, there sometimes police officers do, you know, in fact, make mistakes, okay? It's a reality that happens. And we talked about the fact that mom has I think a friend or a cousin, somebody who's from Kenya, who's a police officer. So we talked about about Black police officers and, you know, who do make good choices. And then all police officers are not in fact bad, but would have been disingenuous, we felt, not to reflect the experiences, you know, that were happening in our country in regards to the disproportionate shootings, you know, of African-American men, women, girls, and boys.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience of the myriad of tragic situations that you've referred to before as the catalyst for your book. Was there a specific incident that made you determine we're going to write this?
Yeah, we wrote this book in the fall of 2016. So it was before George Floyd, Stephon Clark, all of those, but it was after Tamir Rice. And he's, you may remember, he's the 12-year-old boy in Cleveland who was shot by a police officer. And it was also after Trayvon Martin, I believe. And so there wasn't one police shooting, it was more the pattern, honestly, and the fact that they kept happening. And we wondered, how do kids understand this? I mean, they see this on the news. How do parents talk to kids about this stuff? And that's what prompted us to write the book.
Thank you. Another audience member asks, do you find that explaining the reality of and discourse about racism to children differs from explaining it to adults? If so, how do you find it to be different?
I would say, in general, kids are a little more open and less defensive about it. In some ways, that's part of what attracted us to write something that spoke to kids, but then could percolate up to parents and adults, because kids kind of cut to the chase. And, you know, of course it's unfair to treat people differently based on their skin color. Like, who started that? Or, you know, who had the idea of slavery? That's such a weird idea. So their clear-eyed look at some of these issues, I think, is refreshing and, you know, can help adults take a fresh look too.
The challenge is finding the right words, honestly. Like, how do you break it down into words that kids can understand? And again, that was one of the purposes of the book, is to give parents some language to do that. And what we came up with was, it's a pattern. It's a bad pattern, and it's up to kids to create a new pattern. Yeah.
We also felt very strongly that parents are the ones who really want to instill their own values and morals, you know, into their child's lives. We did not think that it was our place to do this, or even the school system's place, which is why the story revolves around conversations within families. And we were hopeful that it would, in fact, create avenues for families out in the real world, quote unquote, to have these kinds of conversations. Our book is not the kind of book that you just give to your child and tell them to go off and read it in a corner, or even in a school, let's say. Shouldn't just be a book that a kid goes off in a corner to read. What's But our vision is that parents would read the book beforehand, okay? And even again, take access to the materials in the back, but it's the caregivers and parents to help them to understand and anticipate what kinds of questions their children might have, and from there begin the conversation that this book creates.
I was going to say I personally marveled how the conversation, the kids are hearing about it in Mrs. Garcia's class. And because we're having these authentic conversations at home, that's where it's drawn back to. So I think that it kind of suggests, and I imagine might have been intentionally, that these conversations are happening. So let's make sure that they're repeated and echoed at home so we have a solid foundation. That was amazing to me. We have another great question from the audience. Do you have a response to the shift in most challenged books to where the top 10 is dominated by books that discuss social justice and racism? What do you make of it, and do you see it continuing?
That's interesting. I imagine that the reasons books have been on this list in the past have to do more with topics of sexuality and gender and religion and things like that. And that this is the context in which you're raising the question, so that now there's more racial justice. Books are more on here for racial justice kinds of things. I mean, maybe we're having these conversations now, and these conversations are perhaps threatening to some people. And some people are uncomfortable with the conversations. I think that some people view these conversations as potentially sensitive, or that the content might be a little scary for kids, right? And so they want to protect their children. But if you think about all the things we teach children, right? We teach children about stranger danger. We teach children about private parts. We teach children that they shouldn't just go with anybody in their car, right? We do this. We know that this will make our kids uncomfortable, but we do it to keep them safe because the outcome is worth the risk. Well, we feel that the outcome of racial justice is worth the risk of temporary discomfort or confusion, or the sensitivity that people are talking about. And that's why we wrote the book.
Thank you. That dovetails nicely with not a question, but a comment from the audience. It says, it sounds like there are many adults who should read this children's book to understand the issues in simple terms. The quotation you shared, pattern of white people being nice to white people and mean to Black people, is so easy to understand. So maybe if we get more picture books and YA books into adult hands, which makes you wonder, how do you envision librarians using this title in a public library where we have all ages?
Oh, that's a really good question.
I actually, I got asked a similar question and thought about it. And I mean, the book was written mostly for, 6 to 8 year olds, plus it can go a little lower and a little higher. So it was written for parents to read to children that aren't yet reading independently. However, I actually think that even if an 8 or 9 year old that can read independently read the book, including the parent section, I have no problem with it. If they're old enough to read and understand those words, there's really nothing that we're suggesting to parents in terms of their conversations or how to define racism and prejudice and discrimination. There's nothing in there that's inappropriate for a kid to read independently. So I think it's, it provides very rich opportunities for conversation, and that's how we envisioned it. But I don't worry about a kid picking it up and reading it if that's what happens to happen in a library.
Sure, and I can really see the book being a part of a series within a library. A series that could address readings that talk about social justice. Certainly, I think that it should not be banned in any library or any classroom setting. I think that it's really the way that the book is utilized that's most helpful.
I think we have some panelists that agree too. Shannon made a wonderful comment in the chat. Just a comment. I think we grossly underestimate what children care about and what they are able to understand. I am in awe every time I meet with my kids at the library. They are really open, honest, and cut to the chase. I think as adults, we do a disservice to our kids when we don't talk about the hard topics. So thank you for your book and your passion to teach.
Very nice, thank you.
Yeah, that reminds me, I wanted to contrast, this is harkening back to a question about children's reactions and relate specifically to the police. I've, with second graders, had really very interesting discussions about the police that I think that were very helpful. These were two different classrooms, but two sides of the equation. So there was one little boy that said, well, I don't think the policeman did anything wrong at all. You know, it's his job to shoot people, if you know. And so this little boy had watched too many cops and robbers or whatever. But I mean, that is how the police are presented on television, that they're constantly shooting people. So we had a big discussion on all the different things that policemen do and the fact, and when is a policeman allowed to shoot somebody, and talked about only if that person, you know, is in danger to seriously hurt another person right then. So that was really helpful to that child to clarifying, you know, that it's not the Wild West out there. On the other hand, on the other side, I had another little second grader who brought up the fact of, well, I wonder what should the punishment be for a policeman that makes a mistake and shoots somebody that wasn't dangerous. And you know, in her own words, she was kind of wrestling with what should the criminal justice system do? And she, you know, her opinion was, well, I think he should have to go to jail some, because even if it was a mistake, the other person is still dead. So here she is wrestling with questions that jurors, you know, have to wrestle with. So that really speaks to how much we underestimate kids. These were comments that came up without me doing much prompting, but led to really rich and interesting discussions.
Thank you. I think that I can dovetail a comment from the audience with a question that we've had prepared. The comment is that sometimes police officers do have to make a decision in a split second or risk their life. And I'd like to couple it with a pre-prepared question. One of the challenges to something happened in our town became public when the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association sent a letter to the governor saying that the book encourages children to fear police officers as unfair, violent, and racist, and asked that the state stop recommending the book for instruction in elementary schools. Why is it important for families to have access to this book and have conversations about racial injustice?
I think that we've started to really answer this question earlier. I think it's really important for families to have these conversations in their home. So again, they can provide their own ideologies, you know, what it is they want their children to know and understand about the racial climate in our country. Okay, so I think it's important for families to have these conversations and not for kids. You know, they're going to overhear it. They may see something on TV. So what is the information that you want your child to take from that? What are the values that your family espouses to? You can be a parent who has anti-racism as part of their ideology, but if you don't talk about this in your home, you know, with your children, if you don't involve your children in activities that are that promote anti-racism, then they'll never know. They'll never know. So I think it's really important for families to have access to these books so these conversations can start. And even with very young kids, they may not totally comprehend, you know, what's going on in the world, what's going on, even with the murder trial of George Floyd, but they hear bits and pieces. And for parents to promote an openness to having conversations, I think is really important. You know, and again, following your child's lead, give them as much information as it seems that they want to know and can digest at that particular time, and of course in a developmentally appropriate manner. But that leaves that door open so that the child can come back later and say, hey, you know, I had another question, Mom. I had another question, Dad, or another instance might have happened, and they know it's okay. And I can go and ask my mom and my dad about that, and I won't get in trouble, and they won't say, shh, you know, that's not good to talk about, which of course leads me to colorblind parenting and race conscious parenting. Just some other, we can talk about that for sure. But That's my reaction. I don't know, Ann, Marianne.
Well, to dovetail on what you just said, we think one of the reasons we included a Black family and white family is we wanted to make the book relevant to diverse types of families, and white families have traditionally been much less likely than families of color to talk about this. And if we don't acknowledge racism and, you know, make an explicit anti-racist commitment, things are not going to get better. I mean, we've tried, white parents have tried colorblind parenting and good intentions for, you know, for my generation, and, you know, we've you know, been at a not great status quo. So but I also wanted to mention educators, that, you know, I really do support the courageous educators that were including this in an appropriate way in their curriculums. And I think that's a valuable way for educators to engage kids by making learning seem relevant to what's happening in the world. And it's also an important way to communicate to kids of color in their classroom that they matter and that their teacher cares about them and their families and their communities. So I think it's very important for those reasons as well.
And that it's everybody's job to change the pattern, right? That this book is relevant, especially to white students who need to change the pattern, right?
Definitely. I wanted to say thank you again as an information scientist, as a curator of community conversations, like many of the audience members, having support in the back of the book where we talk about these questions about what does it mean, like, why did that man shoot the police? Or if you have a child that tells a racist joke, like, what are the appropriate responses to that? It gives us all tools. And I think it echoes what Emily says here in the chat. I really like the idea of using this book as a part of a program series for kids on social justice, something like a monthly social justice story time or read along and discussion for families. The upcoming book would tie in perfectly as well.
I'd like to add to that on our publisher website, Imagination Press website, we have some free resources. We have read aloud tips for educators, and then we have a pretty lengthy book list where we have lists of other books that are similar to ours, like Anastasia Higginbotham's, I forget what it's called.
Not my idea.
Not my idea.
Right, not my idea.
And several others for kids of different ages. And so that might be a resource for educators as well.
Yeah, and that resource list is updated annually, sometimes twice a year. So they're the most up-to-date information that you can find.
That's terrific. Thank you very much. Teresa has a comment too about a question actually about, they want to know how different or difficult was it for you to write for children instead of your usual professional writing? Because it feels like there's a blend of both here.
It actually was pretty easy because we're used to we're used to talking to kids and figuring out how to translate stuff into kid language. So
we talk to kids all day long. So.
I was gonna say it's harder to translate it to the scientific journals that we also publish, right? And I'm just teasing about that, but it was pretty easy. It was pretty easy because that's what we enjoy doing.
So learning and fun and talking about affecting good and social change always makes the time go fast. So I invite any questions again from the audience at this time. And I would like to just ask again, we know about the new book coming out. Are there other projects you'd like to share with us?
Yeah. There's one other one I forgot to mention.
And there's a third one I'm going to mention.
Yeah, let me just do this real quick. The book was translated into Spanish. Algo pasa en mi ciudad, right? So there is a Spanish version of it. Unfortunately, the Spanish version does not have the sample, the note to caregiver in the back, but it is same illustrations, but translated into Spanish. And this just came out, I think, a month or so ago. And then, Ann, you were going to talk about another book.
Yeah, we have myself and a different co-author, a Latina psychiatrist, child psychiatrist, have written a third book in this series that will be coming out a year from now. And that is called Something Happened to My Dad. And the main character is Carmen, a little Latina girl whose father is undocumented and gets detained. And so it's her family and her community's story of how she deals with that family separation. So again, it's another book about that's against the backdrop of a social issue, and can help families talk about the immigration dilemmas and family separation.
Thank you very much. It looks like we have answered all of our audience questions. So I would just like to thank you three again, Marianne and Marietta and Ann. Thank you for this time and the gift of your knowledge and experience today, but also thank you for the excellent work you're doing in your communities and the ripple effects that it will have into ours. It's just been a delight to connect and learn with you today. And I would remind our audience that if you want to learn more information about banned books, you can visit ala.org/bbooks. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for
so much.
hosting such an interesting forum. Thank you for the work y'all do.
Bye-bye.